So we're going to continue our lecture slash critique of the transsexual phenomenon, covering specifically this figure of Harry Benjamin. I will say from the outset, once again, as I've stated in all these epilogue lectures, your focus, if you aren't in the position already, your focus should really be on making sure that you're in good financial situation, making sure you're securing, safe lodging, food, water, developing a support system, developing your capacity to expand your memory and focus on individual tasks for a significant period of time without being distracted. All of those things are more important than the information I'm going to provide you in this lecture, okay? And I covered that in epilogue 1. So if you already have your family set up, you're, financially in a good position, maybe you've already, bought some land or something, or you have a large plot or whatever, you have stuff that's paid off and you're in a good position, then it's time to learn about stuff like this, but not before, okay? So focus on setting up your life in the real world first, because this stuff is eventually, and somewhat in this lecture too, going to get very dark, and people need to have support systems in place before they pursue information like this, okay? So this lecture is going to be a discussion on Harry Benjamin. He is one of the major proponents and 20th century outliners of the concept of transsexualism and transgenderism. And we're also going to, in large part, cover his work, The Transsexual Phenomenon, which you can find in PDF form, in which he explicates on how transsexual / transgender people should be treated. You'll see a lot of familiar language that had just started creeping up again in the modern lexicon, I would say in the last 8 years, where we started defining gender and sex as different things, which from a dictionary perspective had not been the case. Well, Harry Benjamin was doing this in the early 1900s, and we see a lot of the languages from his work is copied today. And we're going to delve into a little bit of the schizophrenia lectures or schizophrenia literature in reference to some of the things he talks about, but we will go into much deeper detail on contemporary literature as it relates to quote-unquote transgenderism in future lectures. But I want to establish all this lineage and also establish that none of this would exist without this collection of individuals promoting these ideas and facilitating them. In the previous lecture with Freud and the lecture before that, we covered sort of a large number of the figures that were responsible for this, the psychoanalysts in Germany and some in the United States that were facilitating these ideas and creating these surgeries, and there will be a little bit more detail about that in this lecture and upcoming lectures. You'll see multiple references to quote-unquote Christine Jorgensen as being this brave figure that resulted in all these people being liberated and true to express their true selves and all that kind of stuff. We'll look at that in the next lecture in more detail, but will be touched on in this one. And finally, I will explicitly connect his work, he will actually explicitly connect his work to the esoteric traditions that I established in the first epilogue lecture. For those that, challenge the supposition that these ideas bear this lineage to them, he will openly show you in his book or The Transsexual Phenomenon that he's borrowing from that lineage. So that's what this lecture is going to entail. Let's continue on here. So let's talk about Harry Benjamin. Harry Benjamin was a German-American endocrinologist and sexologist. There we see that term again over and over again, which we're going to need to look at here pretty soon. Widely known for his clinical work with transgender people. He was born in 1885 and died in 1986. Benjamin was born in Berlin and raised in a German Lutheran home. After pre-medical education in Berlin and Rostock, he joined a regiment of the Prussian Guard. He received his doctorate in medicine in 1912 in Tübingen for a dissertation on tuberculosis. Sexual medicine interested him, but was not part of his medical studies. In 1985, he recalled, "I do not remember going, as a young person, to the lecture by August Forel, whose book, The Sexual Question, was a sensation at the time, at which impressed me greatly. I also met Magnus Hirschfeld, who we talked about in the second transgender lecture, very early on through a girlfriend who knew the police official cop who was in charge of investigating sexual offenses. He in turn was a friend of Hirschfeld's. So I met both men. Hirschfeld was connected to the police who were investigating sexual offenses. Isn't that interesting? They repeatedly took me along on their rounds to the homosexual bars in Berlin. I especially remember the El Dorado with its drag shows, where also many of the customers appeared in the clothing of the other sex. The word transvestite had not yet been invented. Hirschfeld coined it only in 1910 in his well-known study. Benjamin visited the United States in 1913 to work with a quack doctor who claimed to have found a cure for tuberculosis. The liner in which Benjamin was returning to Germany was caught mid-Atlantic by both the outbreak of the First World War and the Royal Navy. Given the choice of a British internment camp as an enemy alien or returning to New York, he used his last dollars to travel back to America, where he made a home for the rest of his life. However, he made many professional connections internationally and visited Europe frequently. Several failed attempts to start a medical career in New York. Benjamin rented a consulting room in which he also slept and started his own general medical practice. Later, he practiced in San Francisco, with many of his patients coming from the nearby Tenderloin district. Worked with transgender people. Prior to arriving in the U.S., he studied at the Institut für Sexualwissenschaft, from this time onward, he began to encounter and treat patients who would be later described as transsexuals. In the 1930s, he studied in Austria with Eugene Steinach. In 1948, in San Francisco, Benjamin was asked by Alfred Kinsey, this is of Kinsey Sex Survey fame, which we'll talk about at a later date, a fellow sexologist, to see a young patient who was anatomically male but insisted on being female. Kinsey had encountered the child as a result of interviews for sexual behavior in the human male, which was published that year. Look at all these citations that this article needs. This case rapidly caused Benjamin's interest in what he would come to call transsexualism, realizing there was a different condition to that of transvestitism, under which adults had such needs had been classified to that time. Despite the psychiatrist with whom Benjamin involved in the case not agreeing on a path of treatment, Benjamin eventually decided to treat the child with estrogen, which had a calming effect, and helped arrange for the mother and child to go to Germany, where surgery to assist the child could be performed. But from there, they ceased to maintain contact, much to Benjamin's regret. So he doesn't know the long-term effects of what exposing this child to estrogen had. Benjamin continued to refine his understanding, went on to treat several hundred patients with similar needs in a similar manner without accepting any patients. Many of his patients were referred by David Caldwell and Robert Stoller and doctors in Denmark. These doctors received hundreds of requests from individuals who had read about the work connected with changing sex as it was then later described. Due to personal political opinions of the American doctors and Danish laws prohibiting reassignment surgery on non-citizens, letters were written to doctors who had aided transsexual individuals, specifically Harry Benjamin. He conducted treatment with selected colleagues of various disciplines, psychiatrist C.L. Ilhenfeld and John Alden, electrologist Martha Foss. We're going to see, actually, this is going to tie back into electromagnetic fields, as I talked about previously, in relation to things like chronic fatigue and COVID. Surgeon Jose Jesus Barbosa, Robert C. Granado, and Georges Burrow. He was a prolific correspondent in both German and English. Many letters are archived in the Magnus Hirschfeld Archive for Sexology. Benjamin's 1966 book, The Transsexual Phenomenon, which we will look at, was immensely important as the first large work describing and explaining the affirmative treatment path he pioneered. Publicity surrounding his patient, Christine Jorgensen, this person right here, brought the issue to the mainstream in 1952 and led to a great many people presenting for assistance internationally. Benjamin also gives Jorgensen credit for advancement of his studies. With indeed, Christine, without you, probably none of this would have happened. The grant, my publications, lectures, etc. Similar cases in other countries, such as Roberta Cowell, whose surgery by Harold Giles in England was in 1951 but was not publicized until 1954, received much publicity in France in 1958, and April Ashley, whose exposure by the British tabloid press was reported worldwide fueled it. Most of them still lived quiet lives. So before continuing on here, I just want to point something out. And this is something we'll see when we look at the Kinsey studies when we talk about homosexuality in an upcoming lecture. This Tenderloin district in Manhattan that he's recruiting all these transgender people from, it's a red light district in the heart of the New York City borough of Manhattan. Red light district means it's an urban area where there's concentrations of prostitution, sex-oriented businesses, sex shops, strip clubs, and adult theaters. That is the reason primarily why I spent all that extensive time on the relationship lecture stuff, is to establish, hey, just so you know, all these things that we're seeing are associated with worse relationship outcomes, and worse relationship outcomes explicitly result in worse outcomes for children. And children are the future adults, so your future is literally impacted by this. In the 1880s, it was the largest number of nightclubs, saloons, bordellos, gambling, casinos, dance halls, and clip joints. You might say all this sexual stuff in and of its own is fine, and just because I've established all this concomitant depression and substance abuse problems and all this stuff with sex addiction disorders, just keep in mind that this is what helps facilitate sex addiction disorders. If there's no opportunity for that, then, I mean, this is what allowed this stuff to flourish and become sort of the modern day. You needed these networks, this network in place first, concomitant with the development of the technology, in order to fuel this demand. High levels of crime in this area. It's the most important precinct in New York, probably the world, the police district, for the amount of police business done there and from the character of the neighborhood. There would be occasional attempts, such as by William Russell Grace and Abraham S. Hewitt, would authorize raids on saloons and brothels, even though those under the protection of Clubber Williams, but the effects were generally temporary. Prostitutes would decamp to outlying areas and then return when the latest crusade was over. It was simply drove up the cost of protection afterwards. They said there was an anti-black mob riot there. It became known as African Broadway because it had a large amount of black population there. Undercover police attempted to arrest a black woman for soliciting the woman's boyfriend, and the officer intervened, and then the officer struck him with a club. He then stabbed the officer with a penknife and ran away, and then the officer died. So not a lot of details there. Their appeals to justice to Mayor Robert A. Van Wyck went unanswered because they said black citizens armed themselves and formed the Citizens Protective League. Who knows what the details of that are. Again, Tenderloin is described as from the police perspective in Behind the Green Lights, Memoirs of Police Captain Cornelius Wilmems. In other words, why are you needing to go to an area of high crime, ill repute, and prostitution to recruit the subjects for your transsexual studies? I mean, if this is a ubiquitous phenomenon that's not culturally, reinforced, it's existent throughout all cultures, why can't you just find a bunch of transgendered people in the middle of the Midwest, for example, or in a rural area in the South? Why are you only able to find it in concentrations of cities where there's high levels of crime with these specific characteristics? Just pointing that out here. He was also focused on life extension. He was married to Gretchen, who he dedicated his 1966 major work. Gretchen revealed to Charles Ihlenfeld about 6 months after they married, Harry brought his mother from Germany to live with them, and that from then on, their bedroom door remained closed. Interesting relationship. The Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association was formed. The group consists of therapists, psychologists, whose devised set of standards of care for the treatment of gender dysphoria, largely based on Benjamin's cases and studies. It was later changed to the World Professional Association for Transgendered Health. So we see this association between Benjamin here and Magnus Hirschfeld, but him forming his own institute and describing transsexuality. I don't know why you have this simple Wikipedia thing, and it basically is very abbreviated. It just says Benjamin was married to a woman called Gretchen, born in Berlin. He was raised in an Ashkenazi Jewish home. American sexologist, endocrinologist, wrote about transsexualism. He died when he was 101. He made the sex orientation scale, which is also known as the Benjamin scale. Some additional information here that's not covered in the other one, but very bare bones. There's some additional stuff, and I've talked about how controlled Wikipedia is in a previous lecture. I believe it's my 26th or 27th lecture, but it should be in the 20 somewhere, about how the editors of Wikipedia are very controlled. Articles can be locked. They basically favor very specific viewpoints, let's say, so you can reference that as to why it might be sanitized. But switching over to Britannica here, again, the same stuff about transsexuality being associated with him, but also Benjamin's politics brought him into the radicals of the time, including Margaret Sanger and Alfred Kinsey. There wasn't really any reference to Margaret Sanger in the previous lecture. He's also a proponent of the Steinach vasoligation or partial vasectomy maneuver devised by his mentor, the Austrian endocrinologist Eugene Steinach, and bills it as a means of restoring a patient's youthful energy and sexual potency. Again, we see these people being very much concerned with controlling the population. So the recommended treatment for people at the time was psychoanalytic therapy, Freudian therapy, aimed at making the mind fit the body. Benjamin, however, was unconvinced of the effectiveness of this approach. And obviously, if you have a hormone imbalance, which we're going to talk about hormone imbalances and gender expression and how this could be corrected without nearly as much chaos as we're observing with this. His idea was, well, I don't think that this psychological approach is going to work, and a more sensible treatment would be to alter the body to better fit the patient's perceived gender. He counseled the patient to travel to Europe, where surgeons perform one of the earliest gender reassignment surgery. He argued that transsexuals were a group distinct from transvestites. Again, the transsexual phenomenon is referenced here. And we see he's the one that basically gets to determine the quote-unquote standards of care. But basically what we're seeing here is that he's saying, I don't agree with this original approach, but his vision is still limited. There is at no point where they accurately identify any sort of biological markers or potential environmental factors that are directly causing the transsexualism in the first place, which should be the first thing that you're trying to identify if you're observing a phenomenon. Instead, they've already come into their approach, both Kinsey and Benjamin and the other psychoanalysts, as either saying we need to tinker with their perception of the self, or we need to make their body match whatever the perception of the self is, instead of looking directly at what mechanistically could be impacting this person's perception of the self. And namely, I'm thinking of things like endocrine disruptors or environmental stresses in utero, which again we'll talk about in much greater detail in subsequent lectures.
Here we actually come to Harry Benjamin's seminal work, The Transsexual Phenomenon, for which he is most known. And we see he's categorizing all of this stuff for us. But the thing is, he's just one individual person. What gives him the authority to be able to generate all these categories? Because we'll see there's some massive scientific liberties that were taken. He says the challenge as a handicap in writing a book on a subject that is not yet covered in the medical literature, transsexualism is such a subject. So if you're being intellectually honest, that means that all he can say is this is a series of case reports in conjunction with some speculation. That doesn't mean he can't do that. After all, we need to have some level of speculation in order to advance hypotheses. But there's no way in which you can argue that this is a scientific work. He describes it, there's no meaningful appraisal of the entire problem. The challenge lies in the novelty of these observations and attempts to describe clinical pictures and events without preconceived notions, with no axes to grind, and with no favorites to play. It will become clear that Mr. Benjamin clearly has favorites to play. Conclusions, therefore, are untainted, growing out of direct observation. As one who is neither surgeon nor psychiatrist, so he openly admits that he doesn't understand the surgical realities of this or the psychiatric realities of this. Yet, as we will see, he's about to speculate and assert actions that should be taken regardless. So He's willingly admitting at the beginning that he's outside of his depth, and yet will go on to say, this is what needs to be done. Now, I don't think that there's inherently a problem with somebody outside of a specific field critiquing it if they're using it based on a logical series of presuppositions, let's say, because quite frankly, a lot of the times in order to get the degree in the field, they're going to be exposed to a lot of basically brainwashing type education. You spend an extensive amount of time in class having to study specifically for answers to a test of which the instructors want you to get the answers they want you to get. You're not there to speculate on or question any of the potential medical orthodoxy, and so you're highly conditioned by the time you get said degree. So obviously critiques from outside of the system will be essential, but this bears worth pointing out as well. He says there exists a relatively small group of people, men more often than women, who want to change their sex. This phenomenon has occasionally been described in its principal symptoms by psychiatrists and psychologists in the past, but a deeper awareness of the problem, especially in general sexological, and that's what he is, a sexologist, as well as his therapeutic implications, were largely neglected. He's going to go on at future points to say, and have many other people say, that transsexualism is not a part of the sexual domain, which means as a sexologist, why is he going out of his way to comment on it? The case of Christine Jorgensen focused attention on the problem as never before. Without her courage and determination, undoubtedly springing from a force deep inside her, transsexualism might still be unknown, certainly unknown by this term. Now, we will explore the Christine Jorgensen case in more detail, and we'll find out that it didn't have as much to do with her courage as it did with certain powerful and wealthy individuals spreading her story. Credit goes to a few Danish physicians who, for the first time, dared to violate the taboo of supposedly inviolate sex and gender concept, who published their findings in the Journal of the American Medical Association. Further, being true physicians, they considered the patient's interest before they thought of possible criticisms by their colleagues. Again, a critique that you could leverage multiple times over is, how do you know that this is in the patient's best interest with no long-term data? How do you know that this is in the patient's best interest without doing thorough evaluation of environments, multiple levels of psychological testing, multiple levels of hormone level testing, looking at any sort of toxic materials, previous traumas, in utero exposure potentially? How do you know that this is in their best interest? He just said we need to do this objectively without, being tainted, and yet he's already characterized the people that invert individuals' genitals as being daring and violating the taboo and being true physicians that care about the patient's interests. So he's lost any and all objectivity at this point already. Conservatism and caution are most commendable traits in governing the progress of science in general and of medicine in particular. This is a tactic that I saw and addressed whenever we looked at the figure of Jonas Salk in his book, before we started talking about the COVID vaccines in detail, Survival of the Wisest, in which he will address an individual's concerns and your original mental opposition, which is exactly why I discussed the Freud lectures, where Freud basically says you can't trigger people's defenses. So he's going to position himself as someone who is concerned about this problem potentially, but he's not going to actually bridge any solutions to that. He's just going to keep proposing what he's already proposing, which is a radical recontextualization of what human beings should be allowed to do to other human beings. Only when conservatism becomes unchanging and rigid, and when caution deteriorates into mere self-interest, do they become negative forces, retarding, blocking, and preventing progress, neither to the benefit of the science nor to that of the patient. Again, you haven't demonstrated that this is going to, quote-unquote, benefit the patients with any concrete degree. Even if they get temporary relief, even if they feel better for 2 or 3 years, there's lots of medication changes that you can initiate in a person and get them to feel better for a short period of time that ultimately, long-term, didn't address the original problem and can ultimately wind up in shortened lifespans, which we will see. When I decided to write this book with the principal objective of describing my own clinical observations of the past decade, I was well aware that I would meet opposition in various quarters and by no means only the medical. Breaking a taboo always stirs quick emotions, although attempts to rationalize may follow. How great this taboo is that aims to protect man's sex or gender was first emphasized by Johann Burchard, psychiatrist at the University of Hamburg. The forces of nature, however, know nothing of this taboo, and the fact remains that intersexes exist. This is the first in a series of swaps that he will later perform intellectually. So he will point out that intersexual people exist, of which they are an extremely small percentage. And yet later he will say, well, the majority of transgender people aren't underdeveloped, therefore this isn't some sort of environmental thing that we're witnessing. So he's invoking the nature of intersexual people, essentially people with malformed genitalia or the starting development of sets of both male and female genitalia, as a means of saying, see, nature produces this, which, as we will discuss in more detail, environmental exposures to things like atrazine produce that. So is that nature or is that man-made synthetic compounds? And as we saw in the first lecture, talking about the esoteric nature of these ideas, we saw that there were tribes of individuals that were using excessive riding of horses to inhibit male development during puberty and result in some sort of pseudo intersex-like condition. An interesting question might be, could there have been previous societies that through various use of herbs, chemical compounds, xenoestrogens, I'm thinking, or estrogen-producing compounds, I'm thinking of things like different types of soy derivatives, et cetera, that could have been exposed to in utero, as we will see in subsequent lectures. Excess amounts of stress during pregnancy can alter sex hormone profiles and behavior. Just demonstrating that there's some people that are intersex, which is a small percentage of the individuals that later choose to identify as transgender, is a false dichotomy here. And he will utilize this tactic multiple times within the course of this document. I've seen too many transsexual patients to let their picture and their suffering be obscured by uninformed, albeit honest, opposition. Furthermore, I felt that after 50 years in the practice of medicine and the evening of life, I need not be concerned with a disapproval that touches much more on morals than on science. Again, we'll see that his sciences are not only immoral but also pseudoscientific. And he describes other people as being uninformed, yet as someone who's directly working with this patient population from an admittedly a myopic viewpoint in his case, he zoomed in, he's highly invested in the emotional component of this. I would argue he probably has an ulterior motive, and he's just positioning himself in this way, given information that we will see in upcoming lectures. But for the time being, he's making all these claims already without doing the appropriate testing or scientific processes in order to state their truth. Keeps invoking over and over again is basically a revolutionary spirit that we need to fight back against the morals and the taboos of this culture. Again, taboos are taboos for a reason. Pedophilia is a taboo. Necrophilia is a taboo. Bestiality is a taboo. All these things are taboos. So just invoking that we need to tear down taboos is not in and of itself some sort of robust argument. It's very strange that he keeps invoking it, and it sort of reveals his true intentions here. He goes, to these true supporters, I generate my heartfelt thanks. Dr. G.B. Lau, psychiatrist, Dr. Richard Green, and sexologist/writer R.E.I. Masters, who will look at some of the Masters and studies, and we'll see that it was also used for changing the culture. Mr. Arthur Sepos, president of the Julian Press, like my associate, Dr. Leo Woolman, surgeon and gynecologist, for his editorial advice. Also my friend, Dr. Wardell Pomeroy, Dr. Richard D. Levidow, and New York attorney at law for checking the accuracy of this chapter on legal suspects. And so again, a network of individuals working in tandem with each other to advance a specific ideology as it relates to transgenderism. My sincere appreciation goes to Dr. Robert W. Laidlaw and Johannes Burchard, psychiatrist, and to editor Mr. Brooking Tatum for their encouragement and interest in this book. Indirect encouragement came unexpectedly when Mr. Reed Erickson of the Erickson Educational Foundation offered me a grant for 3 years to conduct research in transvestitism and transsexualism. We will follow up on Reed Erickson in a moment, but keep this in mind. Without Reed Erickson's financing, we wouldn't hear so much about Harry Benjamin. Reed Erickson is the one that gave Harry Benjamin his money to conduct this research. Or I can also thank Mrs. Robert Allen and much admired Virginia of my office staff for her help in this aspect of the book's preparation. We don't know necessarily who all these people are. My thanks to Mrs. Rhoda Shapiro in New York and Mrs. Maureen Maloney in San Francisco for their ever-ready and valuable assistance. He doesn't explicate on any of their roles other than that. The symphony of sexes, that's what he says. Now, keep in mind that he's saying this, he's using the term symphony of sexes in this section, and how he later will define it. The more sex is studied in its nature and implications, the more it loses an exact scientific meaning. Full stop. So he's just said that other people above are unscientific and they're locked in their conservatism and their morals are holding them back, and we need to break all these taboos. And then he says, as a sexologist, the more we study it, the more it loses an exact scientific meaning. So if you can't define it scientifically, how are you going to make assertions about it that you believe to be true and that other people should follow? I understand that a lot of the statements I've made may sound nitpicky or overly critical, but when you're dealing with something of this magnitude, in this fashion, and you've described other people as being unscientific, and then when you finally get past your introduction and in literally the second sentence you're saying, well, we're losing scientific meaning, how can you make assertions about it? In which case, the only assertions you could make would be in the philosophical or religious context, arenas in which you are not trained as a quote-unquote sexologist. And again, it's fine to speculate, but if you're speculating, admit that you're speculating and don't tell other people to break up their rigidity and stop being so unscientific when all that you're doing, if you're being intellectually honest, is pure speculation. The fact that there's a multitude of alternatives to the approach that he's taking that he doesn't address in the entire text of the book, which makes me question his ultimate conclusions about this topic. The anatomical structures, so sacred to many, come nearer and nearer to being dethroned. Only the social and legal significance of sex emerge and remain. No, they don't. Why? How can I say that about those anatomical structures being dethroned? Because they are necessary for heterosexual couples to reproduce and have children. If you do not have a functional male anatomy and a functional female anatomy, two individuals cannot produce children together, period. You can do things like artificial insemination, potentially, that require external support from the medical administration, but they prevent individuals from engaging in the exact process that has brought us all into existence in the first place. So the fact that he's already stating things like this, none of these statements are scientific, saying the anatomical structures are being dethroned is not scientific. And in fact, an increase in the number of intersex people or people with genital malformations would necessarily result in a form of population reduction, something that we will discuss in more detail as far as causes and effects in future lectures. Only the social and legal significance of sex emerge and remain. This is an outright lie. There are very real and direct and more important consequences of sex than just social and legal significance. What is the main highlighted, indicated purpose of sexuality, of sex in the first place? To produce children, dummy. The fact that in these few sentences he's already dismissed the creation of life as essential to those anatomical structures and to sex tells you how off the wall and off the mark Mr. Harry Benjamin is from the outset. According to the dictionary, sex is synonymous with gender, but in actuality this is not true. So this is one of the first places that you see this idea expressed. because prior to this, they basically were synonymous. When people were talking about sex, they were talking about gender. And here is the origin of how this term became redefined. Harry Benjamin is not powerful enough to alter Webster's dictionary. There had to be a concerted effort on the part of wealthy, powerful individuals with an agenda to accomplish this task. Some of this network we've started to explore, and we will continue to explore as we develop these ideas. It will become apparent in the following pages that sex is more applicable where there is implication of sexuality, of libido, and sexual activity. Gender is the non-sexual side of sex, is how he's going to define it, but later he's going to talk about sexuality in terms of gender expression as well. Because, I mean, you really can't separate these things out from each other in terms of sexual behavior, just given the mechanics of sex. If you are physically male or you are physically female, the mechanics of sexual behavior are going to be different for you, and your chosen partner will alter the mechanics of sex. And if he chooses to characterize this in this way, then as a sexologist, he has no authority to speak on gender whatsoever, because if gender is entirely separate from sex, at some points during this text he will argue that, and in some points during this text he'll point out how obviously interlinked that they are. But if he's choosing to characterize these as separate entities, then as a sexologist, he has no capacity whatsoever to speak on gender, except purely in the realm of speculation, which again is fine, but you should characterize it as such, and you shouldn't be telling anybody else how they should or shouldn't be behaving about it, because you have no authority by which to do so. With the advancement of biological and especially genetic studies, the concept in male and female has become rather uncertain. Okay, later he's going to go on to say how that's basically have it locked into our chromosomes and blood cells from birth anyway, and this is immutable and unchangeable. But now he's saying the differentiation has become uncertain. There is no longer an absolute division. The dominant status of the genital organs for determination of one's sex has been shaken. Again, we scientifically we use chromosomes, not genitalia, but let's continue on, at least from a current modern scientific standpoint. Furthermore, there's also the psychological reaction to sex, which is widely different in different individuals. It means one thing to an objective scientist, for instance, such a man as Kinsey. We're going to see just how ridiculous this statement is in future lectures, that you think Alfred Kinsey is objective, okay? And then he basically goes on to describe what we would currently see as a bunch of people saying, well, that's true for you and not true for me, or this is my truth, or this is your truth, or whatever, because he's basically saying, well, the biologist and the medical man, the psychologist, the sociologist, all have a different angle for the study of sex. Okay, but if that's the approach you're taking, you can't make any scientific assertions about it. So you're deliberately, before we even get into the case reports that you're talking about, he's deliberately muddying the water so we have no solid vantage point or series of axioms by which to address the information he's about to present us with. So this little preamble here, I would argue, is a preconditioning statement, and it's very reminiscent of the psychoanalysts of the times, namely Freud, who would use tactics like these in order to manipulate unsuspecting people who think that they have your best interest at heart. The object and purpose of sexual relations varies with various persons and under various circumstances. In the animal world, the sex urge is the instrument for procreation. Yet the Catholic Church would want just that, sexual relation for the same purpose in man as in animals. Procreation only. So again, I am not Catholic. I'm not saying you should be Catholic or anything like that. But just like we saw with Freud, who is his opponent? It's the Catholic Church. So again, and as we'll see with a lot of these other individuals, it seems clear to me that there's an animus between these psychoanalysts, powerful, wealthy individuals, and the Catholic Church. Well, why is the Catholic Church so hated? Well, they push procreation very excessively. They're anti-abortion, anti-birth control. They've since become less that now. So If you were a pro-population control person in the 1950s and 60s, who is the giant that you must slay in order to accomplish your task? Well, it's the Roman Catholic Church. Again, I'm not saying that everything the Catholic Church has done is great. Once again, I am not Catholic. I'm not telling you to be Catholic. I'm saying from a pragmatic standpoint, zoom out and look at this stuff. If you want population control, who stands in your way? At the time specifically, and as a group that is, from a demographic standpoint, only going to increase given their propensity to push individuals to have large families, if you were looking at this from a multi-generational perspective and you wanted to cut off your opponent in the future, you need them to have fewer children. Again, that's why I've critiqued red pill and feminism and all these other sorts of things in the past. Regardless of your personal feelings about them, the reason that they are pushed is not to give you freedom, it's to decrease the number of people, which enhances their ability to control society. A person is either male or female, Adam or Eve. With more learning comes more doubt. The more sophisticated realize that every Adam contains elements of Eve, and every Eve harbors traces of Adam, physically as well as psychologically. Again, as he will himself will admit later, the chromosomes are different. The reproductive potential is entirely different. Saying that because you have some level of estrogen in your body as a man or some level of testosterone in your body as a woman means that you're this pseudo-hermaphroditic being that is leaving all of this separate energy untapped. If you're a man, your feminine energy is being suppressed or untapped, and it's unhealthy. Or if you're a woman, your male energy is being untapped and it's unhealthy. No, I would argue this necessitates the ability, requires you to learn how to communicate with somebody different with yourself and put other people's perspectives into account and understand the value of other people while bringing your own value with your own energy. So this isn't some sort of sexual inversion process that needs to take place. It's beneficial that you have some apparatus within yourself by which to connect to the opposite sex. And the requirement in order to truly do that requires you to think about somebody else other than yourself and not be selfish, instead of being a pseudo-hermaphrodite who all the answers are contained within you. You might be confused by some of these statements if you haven't watched the first lecture. These lectures are meant to be viewed in order, but I go in more detail on that concept in that lecture. The better educated person knows the existence of intersexes, of true and pseudo hermaphrodites in whom the physical sex is in doubt. So once again, what have we done so far? The Catholic Church is the problem. The unscientific are the problem. Yet this is an issue that is getting increasingly difficult to define scientifically. Better educated people know about intersex individuals, yet as we'll say, the majority of these people aren't intersex, and we haven't explored any of the environmental factors that can contribute to intersex individuals in the first place. Yet here we are with him making all these assertions. Here must be added the picture of the immature sexuality, the sexuality of the child. This is where I despise these people. Polymorph, perverse, and psychoanalytic terminology. Why are we even talking about sexuality in the context? Some of which frequently persists into adulthood and then may give rise to homo and bisexuality, to all kinds of deviations such as sadomasochism and often bizarre forms of various fetishisms. Some individuals do get stuck in their infantile sexuality. So none of this terminology would be acceptable to the modern left as far as the development of these proclivities. Yet here he's openly admitting some of these things can take place. He's linking it to an infantile sexuality, which is gross, but he isn't willing to explore the same ideas as it relates to transsexuality. Okay, infantile development leads to these sexual proclivities and all this sorts of stuff. Okay, then how come you're not making the same argument for transsexualism?
And later we'll see that he kind of does when he starts associating particular other things with transsexualism. that he himself has identified, it kind of creates a disturbing picture of this, which makes sense given where he's taking his sample size from, the Tenderloin district, where there's people using drugs and engaging in prostitution and all sorts of other unregulated, unrestricted sexual behavior.
The purpose of scientific investigation is to bring more clarity, more light into fields of obscurity. Modern researchers, however, delving into the riddle of sex, have actually produced so far more obscurity. Again, the same idea. Okay, I want to skip forward to this part before dancing around it too much. So he goes on to say there are X and Y chromosomes. Normal female is XX, normal male is XY. Abnormalities may occur, and you may get XXY, XXYY, and even XXXXY, and so on have been observed with more or less severe defects. Some of these patterns have been aptly described as mosaic. According to recent investigations, it seems the more severe the chromosomal abnormalities, the more marked are mental retardation, testicular cell distortion, and genital as well as skeletal disorders. So if we see all of these other problems associated with this, why are we pushing this agenda? Why are we not, quote unquote, looking for a cure or something like that? Instead of saying, well, this is how it is, we're not going to identify any potential causes, mind you, but because some of these small percentage of people exist, which admittedly have poorer health, that means all forms of gender expression for everyone are equally valid, and nobody should resist this in any way, shape, or form. The pattern of the sex chromosomes, the so-called sex determinants, remains frozen in every body cell, including blood cells. The true sex of an individual can therefore be diagnosed from these cell cultures, usually taken from microscopic examination. So for all of his nonsense about the confusion as it relates to sexuality, a couple pages later he openly admits, okay, but we can tell literally from cell structures, they're frozen in every cell of your body that you're male or female. Or you have some sort of chromosomal abnormality, in which case you are have a much higher likelihood to be mentally retarded, have a genital disorder which would prohibit you from reproducing anyway, or having a skeletal disorder. Again, Harry Benjamin, what are we doing here?
Now, here we get to the interpretations of transvestitism, and this is where Mr. Benjamin sort of betrays himself a little bit. He talks about writers have expressed transvestitism in association with homosexuality, and he says unprejudiced observers, this does not ring true. Kinsey and his collaborators also considered this incorrect. Now, again, when we cover Kinsey, when we're talking about homosexuality, we'll see just how ridiculous it is for Harry Benjamin to act like Kinsey, with all of his later admitted faked research of extremely questionable character, to say the least, is somehow an objective observer. Psychoanalytic theories are something like a cult, if not a religion, and are often quite incomprehensible to ordinary clinicians. I would argue this is true, and again, you can reference the Freud lecture where I talked about this in more detail, and the reason why I'm highlighting this section. Psychoanalysis has a language and jargon all its own. In the field of transvestism and homosexuality, we owe the psychoanalyst the concepts of the mother with a penis, the phallic woman, and the castration fear, which transvestitism attempts to overcome. Where did they get these ideas? From the esoteric traditions that we talked about previously, right? The hermaphroditic god being of Rosicrucianism and Freemasonry that we talked about in the first lecture. These psychoanalytic concepts have been accepted variously as important scientific discoveries or as ingenious theories, but has always been criticized and rejected as merely intellectual games or a sophisticated voodoo. Now, and here's the thing I do want to highlight. He's basically saying that it's quite incomprehensible to ordinary clinicians, and then he's saying, well, but they have been criticized, but we owe them these explanations. Well, any system of thought that you're utilizing to administer some sort of treatment that lends itself to incomprehensibility shouldn't be regarded as helpful. You should be able to clearly describe it. You would not be able to get away with this in the field of engineering. If people don't understand how, waveforms work or how circuits work or things like that, we wouldn't have functional electronics. So in this concept, when we're utilizing tactics like psychoanalysis the way Freud utilized it as a means of control, as we discussed in the Freud lectures, now it necessarily has to be abstract and obscure. Why? Because if people were aware consciously of what you were doing, it wouldn't work. That's the crux of the problem I have with these sorts of psychoanalytic ideas and these esoteric ideas. They are deliberately designed, in Freud's own words, to quote unquote get behind your defenses instead of lead you to a series of axiomatic principles by which you can reliably produce conclusions. John Burchard, a psychiatrist out of Hamburg in Germany, gives a much more acceptable interpretation. So what have we seen Harry Benjamin do here? He's basically said anybody that says that this behavior is strange, abnormal, or the result of some sort of pseudo-latent homosexuality is wrong, and this guy is closer to acceptable. As determined by who? Well, Harry Benjamin, who works with transsexual people, whose practice largely revolves around them. Homosexuals and heterosexual transvestites and transsexuals are sexually double-oriented toward the ego and toward a partner. This concept of the ego is not one that's largely accepted anymore. The basis for his theory, and we'll see where he's getting these theories from here in a moment, is not something that's a scientifically verifiable principle. Freud himself, if alive today, would not deny a possible constitutional basis, as he believed in hereditary, organically fixed, and not educational factors. I think both things are the case. I think you can utilize psychological mechanisms to leverage against people, to get them to manifest large differences in their behavior that they wouldn't otherwise do. And I also think there's lots of things that can happen in utero and during a person's early childhood with exposure to certain chemical compounds. Again, I'll reference atrazine, that could certainly alter somebody's brain structure. And I will, in subsequent lectures prove that in various ways. But again, just because it's hereditary, quote unquote, doesn't mean it doesn't have a cause. We don't, for things like Duchenne's muscular dystrophy or cerebral palsy, we don't say it's hereditary, therefore we should cherish it and flourish it and develop it and put it all over the TV and talk about how wonderful it is. No, we seek to find cures for these diseases. And the fact that somebody would come along and tell me that it's quote unquote transphobic to describe it as a disease speaks to how much psychological enforcement at the top down level this has been enforced. You have no intrinsic reason for believing one way or another about transgenderism in and of yourself other than by the basis of your original belief system, which, as we've seen on the case of the esoteric traditions, is going to be pro-transsexual, as we've seen on the case of the conservative religions, i.e. traditional Christianity, Islam, etc., they're going to have a decidedly negative view of transsexualism. So you can utilize whatever tools you want to try and manifest this in reality or not based on that pre-existing belief system. But here's where the direct contact that people might be, espousing, well, you're making some tenuous links to Freud here just because he's connected to all these people. No. Around 1930, Harry Benjamin once called on Freud during one of my visits to Vienna. At that time, he was still in his home and office at Bergstrasse. A mutual friend, Dr. Eugene Steineck, professor of physiology at Vienna University and the famous discoverer of the puberty gland, had made the introduction and appointment to me. So in that one paragraph, we've already established what? Freud, Harry Benjamin, and the discoverer of basically hormonal induction that's going to manifest itself in different presentations in human beings were all interconnected to each other. So one, there's no excuse for Harry Benjamin not to pursue the biological hypothesis and see if it could be reversed the other way, i.e. providing testosterone injections to effeminate men instead of providing estrogen injections to further feminize them. Again, I'm not saying that's the right route to take, but also that he was in direct correspondence with Freud. The hour I spent with Freud can never be forgotten. Among many other topics, we discussed the body-mind relationship. And when the pun came to mind that the disharmony of the emotions may well be to disharmony of our endocrine glands, Freud laughed and fully agreed. As we'll see, the feedback works both ways. Your emotions, thought processes, etc. will influence your hormonal secretions, cortisol, drops in testosterone, etc., and the hormonal secretions, or lack thereof, will facilitate your thinking. And so we're establishing here that they knew how these processes worked, and they would also know how to manipulate them. He said Freud was not so Freudian in the sense of some of today's practitioners. His biological background and training protected him against the extremism of the burglar and like types. Freud was big enough to recognize his own occasional errors, admit them, and try to correct them. I would argue he was able to leverage when the current process he was engaging in wasn't actually benefiting him coming toward his goals, which admittedly was the conquering of Rome and the destruction of the Catholic Church, and making more money, two things I established in the Freud lecture. So he may have I would argue it's more him uncovering that the current track he was on wasn't in achievement of those goals, and then he wound up changing them to accommodate that. What about personal lives that he's observing? What is Harry Benjamin openly admitting he's observing? For their future psychological development, children should certainly be protected against learning of their father's transvestitism and seeing him dressed. Especially a boy's identification with the father image may suffer irreparable damage. I have one patient, a transsexual, who told me this patient living as a woman, although she had no operation, has never seen her father dressed as a man, nor has she ever seen her mother, who also is a transvestite, dressed as a woman. It would appear most unlikely that under such pathological conditioning, a normal adult male could have resulted. So we will look at this in way more detail when we look at homosexuality, as far as what happens to kids raised by homosexual parents. But yeah, quite obviously, you've seen inversion of the gender roles from the time that they're born. And Harry Benjamin's admitting, yeah, this definitely affected this transsexual person, in my opinion. So if more and more people are going to be engaging in this, do we not see how it's going to increase the social valence of this and result in more and more of this behavior? There's no such thing as just a neutral, irrelevant stimuli here. In any event, it seems inexcusable for any father to let his children seem openly indulging in his transvestitic pleasures. Few wives and mothers will stand for it either. They say in lacking substitutes, they'll develop excessive alcohol, drug habits, and nervous irritability. We'll actually look at the example of Ed Wood later, and he was an open transvestite and was addressing all these things. And yet, ultimately, him and his wife both succumbed to alcoholism. So he's saying that, if they're not allowed to engage in it, the end result could be alcoholism and depression and all this stuff. Well, the ones that are engaging in it are also getting alcoholism and depression. So how do we know there's not an underlying psychological problem that's contributing to it, instead of always ascribing it to, well, society's just not accepting enough, and that's why they're depressed. One of my patients, a rather shy and timid person as a man, changes completely when he assumes his female role. As a woman, he loses his self-consciousness and his feelings of insecurity, which he himself explains. Self-reliance, a certain aggressive and dominance are expected of a man. This is against my nature, is not expected of a woman. I feel at ease, more secure, and my true self. Do you feel more your true self, or do you feel like you're getting out of a sense of responsibility that you would normally have as a man to potentially be a protector? I'm not saying everybody can be 6'6", 280 pounds of raw muscle and a cage fighter. Okay, that's not realistic. But you can be a better, more masculine version of what you are, and you can develop competence in multiple different arenas. And this is a very powerful means of escaping that, particularly in today's culture, which will pat you on the back and give you rewards for doing that. And you basically have a built-in community for which you can relate to if you choose to express yourself in this way. The wives of transvestites constitute a psychological problem by themselves. I've spoken to at least a dozen. Most of them put up a brave front, claiming to be unaffected in their love for their husbands, but admitting they're certainly not happy about it, even suffering acutely at times. Few, but a very few, say they enjoy helping their husbands to dress and make up. I've asked myself the same question many times. Only a deeper psychological probing may provide the answers. And again, I want to express this over and over and over again. There will be people that will lie to the day that they die about, no, it doesn't affect me at all. It's fine. And Harry Benjamin knows that they're lying. Why? Well, based on their body language and their responses. And the longer he spends with them, the more they are going to admit that they really don't enjoy this. This doesn't just affect nobody else. It's negatively impacting other people. And what are we seeing in conjunction? This is what Harry Benjamin has identified. Common factors associated with transgender/transsexual people, accompanying perversions or deviations that often complicate transvestitism, have been hinted at earlier. They occasionally worry the wives particularly or aggravate their problems. They are rarely mentioned in the literature except in TV publications. So wait a minute. The medical literature isn't capturing this. Why isn't the medical literature capturing this? Why is the medical literature in a state where if it's going to talk about transsexualism in the 1960s, it's going to avoid these concomitant deviations that cause problems with the marriage, but that are put in transvestite publications? In other words, the marketing strategy for transvestite lifestyles includes this stuff. The most dangerous is probably the desire for bondage, occasionally with self-strangulation attempts. How often these attempts may go just a little too far or may come just a little too late, and an unexplained and mysterious suicide makes the headlines as anybody's guess. Flagellation is occasionally demanded by TVs visiting prostitutes in female attire or wanting to dress in their homes and merely girl talk to them like one girl to another. Some TVs with masochistic inclinations want to be humiliated at the same time. They dress in a servant girl's clothes and they want to be ordered around to do washing, cleaning, scrubbing of floors, and the like. They are willing to pay well for this kind of sex service. I noted a cardiologist who indulged regularly in this. Fetishism complicates the TV's sex lives. At the same time, it puts an additional strain on married life. There are those who like furs or leathers. They buy jackets, coats at considerable expense, and she can't afford anything like it for her own wardrobe. This applies equally to expensive silk gowns, extra high heels, etc., etc. Much has been made of the narcissistic tendencies in TVs. Most of them spend an abnormal amount of time in front of the mirror, admiring their image as women, only too often overdressing and over-adorning themselves with costume jewelry. Exaggerated female vanity may account for the same action and also for the delight in being photographed in all kinds of poses to show off their new dresses, wigs, or hairdos. We see narcissistic tendencies, bondage and self-flagellation tendencies, and basically uncontrolled spending as it relates to these outfits. All of these are associated with impaired self-control type behaviors. So if we're seeing these things concurrently with transvestitism, there's clearly an inhibition problem here. Why are we trying to encourage this again? Why are we saying, well, you need to pursue indulging in it? Well, these are people that are dressing up and they're narcissistically staring at themselves and perpetuating this state in their mind. And when we actually look at the figure of Christine Jorgensen, as Harry Abraham has referenced her in this text, we'll see some interesting parallels in her own story that help explicate why Jorgensen turned out the way that they did. And if we scroll further down, we see these tables, onset of this behavior, okay? They're saying that this is part of a sexual practice because they're wearing this stuff while they're, reported that the following were worn during intercourse. where he keeps trying to separate out the gender and sexual. No, it's manifesting in differences in sexual behavior. Just as we saw above, they're engaging in masochism and choking themselves and all this sorts of stuff. Okay, there's definitely a sexual component to this. So your argument that this is, completely separate phenomenon is not true. And if we see the onset of this, the majority of this is happening in young children. This is pre-puberty years. The majority, and he has this wide range, 10 to 17.9 years, 39%. 53% of the time, it's before they're 10 years old that this behavior is manifesting itself. So it's clearly a childhood association that's taking place here. And only 8% are after the age of 18. So still an adolescent period where their mind is still highly vulnerable is when they're developing these attitudes. Again, we'll look at Christine Jorgensen's autobiography later. Wife's attitude, completely accepting and cooperative, 25%. Everybody else is either trying to ignore it or doesn't like it at all. And then he's basically saying, according to his own observations, he highly doubts that 25% is actually accurate. It's resulting in problems in marriages, which produce children. The stabler the marriage is, the more loving and kind the marriage is. Again, as I established in the relationship lectures, kids turn out better the more the parents focus on the marriage versus careers or even the children. And here we see somebody, in the case of these transsexuals and transvestites, that's narcissistically focusing on themselves. And it tends to take place during a childlike stage, and that seems like a time period that they may be reverting back to in some sense. When we look at his section on the male transsexual here, okay, in life and love, there's hardly a person so constantly unhappy as the transsexual before a sex change. We will look at data on this, by the way, contemporary data that both supports and negates this, and we'll compare and contrast them and see just how happy people are years after they've had their genitals inverted. Only for short periods of his or her life, such as those rare moments of hope when a conversion operation seems attainable, or when successfully assuming the identity of a woman in name and dress, is he able to forget his misery. Him forever a candidate for self-mutilation, suicide, or its attempt. The false belief obtained from alcohol and drugs is not an infrequent complication. Again, as we'll see, those problems still continue to persist after the surgery in contemporary long-term follow-up, as we will compare and contrast later. Self-mutilations are no rarity and have occurred in at least 4 of my patients out of a total of 152 transsexual males. 2 of them tried to castrate themselves but had to give up and call a doctor. 1 succeeded with the help of a friend in completing the job. 3 patients who castrated themselves or attempted it eventually succeeded in being operated upon in the U.S., having a vagina constructed. Suicides with motive unknown have undoubtedly occurred because of the inability to procure surgical help for the sex change. Again, we will see suicide data post-sex change and see just how reliable this is. And so here's where he tugs at our heartstrings. He says, this person wrote this letter, Dear Mr. Benjamin, I've accepted my fate. I'm so miserable, I'm going to kill myself. Okay? And this was forever invoked as the sword against anybody in objection to these ideas forevermore. If you don't let your kid transition, they will kill themselves. If you don't let this transgender person have this surgery, they're going to kill themselves. If you don't do X, Y, or Z, that's exactly what this person says that they want, they're going to kill themselves. And that was the tactic that Perry Benjamin developed for the rest of transsexual life forevermore. Transsexuals are often an enormous problem to their families. They are embarrassingly feminine in manner, let their hair grow long, may have love affairs with normal men, threaten suicide when opposed too much, speak of future life as a woman after the operation without much regard for the feelings of others, especially parents who cannot easily accept having a daughter instead of a son, or siblings who may respond the same way to having a sister instead of a brother. Notice the narcissistic tendencies that we already pointed out previously. There's a detachment here, and we'll look at some additional psychological information here. We see with schizophrenia, self-mutilation is fairly common. Okay, primary forms include ocular, genital, and limb mutilation. Limb mutilation is the least common. 42-year-old man with schizophrenia who was hospitalized due to osteomyelitis of auto-amputated digits. It's a rare but severe mental disorder affecting about 1% of the general population. Diagnosed with such as delusions, hallucinations, cognitive symptoms, disorganized thinking and speech, negative symptoms such as apathy, anhedonia, and catatonia. In the context of psychiatric illness, an SSM is further divided into major and minor, including nail biting, hair pulling, and skin cutting. Major acts are more sporadic and often result in permanent organ damage. Examples of major self-mutilation include enucleation of the eye, genital self-mutilation, and auto-amputation of the limbs. So we've seen in the medical literature, this is 2023, genital mutilation is a consequence of schizophrenia. So why are we not looking at, and this has been documented in the medical literature prior to this and since, why are we not testing them for this issue? Indirect self-destructiveness in individuals with schizophrenia. Patients with schizophrenia displayed more behaviors that were indirectly self-destructive than healthy controls. They scored better than healthy controls only on caring for their own health. The lowest intensity of behaviors connected with active form of indirect self-destructiveness, and highest with passive forms, poor health maintenance, lack of planfulness, etc., etc. Major self-mutilation in first episode of psychosis. Catastrophic complication of severe mental illness. People have psychotic disorder, usually a schizophrenia spectrum psychosis. Psychotic illness was documented in 143 of 189 cases of MSM, of whom 119 were diagnosed with schizophrenia spectrum psychosis. So the majority of time we see this mutilation, self-mutilation, it's a consequence of schizophrenic type disorders. Body image and body experience disturbances in schizophrenia, an attempt to introduce concept of body self as a conceptual framework. Disturbances in body experience are described as key schizophrenia symptoms and early disease predictors. Different disorders relating to body experience are presented, but only a few empirical studies have aimed to distinguish the characteristics of body experience in schizophrenia and have been selected arbitrarily and without reference to a cohesive theoretical model. Why? This is 2016, this paper is coming out. We have this association with out-of-body, abnormal body experiences and genital mutilation with schizophrenia. Why have we not explored this relationship further when back in the early 1900s we're telling people that they're transgender and they need to proceed with a surgery? When we haven't even fully explored this relationship. Body disturbance in schizophrenia spectrum populations, introducing the Benton as all body disturbance inventory designed to quantify bodily disturbances with respect to frequency and vividness of this experience, as well as the degree of distress associated with them. Drawings that depicted different aspects of aberrant bodily self-experiences were presented with accompanying captions. Individuals with schizophrenia, older healthy controls, and college students participated in 2 alternate versions. Results suggest that the BODI is a useful tool that accurately captures body self-disturbances, has the potential to predict psychosis risk in healthy young individuals. We have this out-of-body experience, and we see counter-reality type stuff. And this is often observed in individuals that are physically isolated and tend to spend a lot of time thinking of things in fantastical or constantly fantasizing instead of existing in the real world. It enhances one's ability to kind of separate from one's own environment. So you think about the current world we're living in this digital world in which anything is possible, and we'll look at the example of Christine Jorgensen in her own autobiography, in her own words, lest you be saying that I'm, just speculating too much about this stuff. We'll see that this person was isolated. They were abnormally feminine for a boy when they were growing up. Jorgensen's own sister will write a paper in college about how spending too much time with girls and not spending time with boys resulted in increased effeminate behavior, as the sister was looking for answers as to Jorgensen's behavior. And we'll see certain behaviors didn't start until they read about certain topics in the library. So it wasn't an internal intrinsic conclusion that this person came to about themselves. Okay, we'll look at that in more detail. But given all these associations with schizophrenic type disorders, that we're seeing the same type of things we're seeing in Harry Benjamin's transgender people, did he just treat them with psychoanalysis and said it failed, or did he actually engage in true schizophrenic type treatments with these individuals first before saying there's no way that they can be helped other than having their genitals inverted and being put on hormones?
And this is characterized in this statement in the section, the transsexual's plight here. I cannot stand all this anymore, said one of my patients, characteristically pointing downward. It does not belong to me. It must go. So there's like a foreign object sort of syndrome idea associated with this. And if you think about it, let's say that you had schizophrenic type issues, and then you're confronted with somebody like Harry Benjamin, who's going to say that who's going to define that you're a transsexual, and then now he will give you this format by which the schizophrenic issue with which you're currently experiencing has a resolution, and the resolution is hormones and his surgery. It doesn't matter if that's really the cause of the problem or not. You're going to come to believe it, and schizophrenics have a tendency to fixate on certain things. So I'm just pointing that out. I haven't proved any of this yet. We're going to look at some neural correlates here and cross-index some information here. But I just want to point, what I'm mainly trying to establish in this lecture is to point out that there's a myriad of avenues that Harry Benjamin could have gone down to explain this phenomenon, which he doesn't. Yet he's openly explaining at the beginning many of these factors that he doesn't address in any significant detail, and he calls detractors of his position as being unscientific while simultaneously saying that you can't scientifically define what a gender is or even what sex is. It becomes muddy, it becomes obscure, while simultaneously also saying that, well, it's the chromatin that determines what sex is, but gender is something different. Okay, so just this is who we're dealing with here. This is the basis of the transsexual ideology. Doesn't originate with Harry Benjamin. It originates with these esoteric traditions. But in a modern context, this is one of the seminal documents here, the transsexual phenomenon that we've been looking through. Again, yet another section, definitely not for children, not for, people that are squeamish about this type of stuff, but just pointing out for people that are saying this doesn't have, well, his sexuality is separate from this, it's a completely separate thing. Psychological state and sex life in transsexuals. This is what Harry Benjamin was documenting as a pro-transsexual person, one of the first pro-transsexual people. The need for recognition, attention, and acceptance, coupled with inner feelings of being rejected and ignored, is prominent in all subjects. They want attention, they want to feel accepted. Many transsexuals have no overt sex life at all. Sex drive in some of them is turned inward toward their own ego. And you think about what kind of pathological sorts of states can happen with that. Again, just like we saw previously with narcissistic tendencies. Masturbation is occasionally practiced, but the urge for it is low, and under estrogen treatment gets even lower to the point of zero. Other transsexuals, however, have a sex life. There are those who still preserve a quote-unquote normal married life, that is to say with a woman. They say they are able to have sex relations with the help of fantasies by taking a succubus under position in intercourse or by wearing a female nightgown. Some of these married transsexuals described to me a mental state during intercourse in which the penis seems to lose its identity of ownership. It may just as well be my wife's being inserted into me as vice versa. Yeah, clearly a strange phenomenon that we're observing here. Another said bluntly, I don't know whether I screw or I am being screwed. Psychoanalysts may find ingenious explanations for such a phenomenon. Other transsexuals have normal boyfriends who treat them as girls. Sex relations vary. The husband most often substitute the anus for the not yet existing vagina. So it's basically sodomy is what we're talking about. orgasm may be claimed by the wife, but especially under estrogen treatment, quote unquote, she has difficulty getting an erection, which is not considered any handicap at all, rather the opposite, as all manifestation of masculinity are abhorred. They're often described as painful, which may have psychosomatic explanation. Ejaculations gradually diminish and finally disappear as the prostate shrinks under estrogen therapy. So it markedly decreases their sexual pleasure. They're engaging in sodomy. So all of this serves to what? They're not going to be having any children. The husband in such a union is an interesting psychological study. Are they actually latent homosexual inclinations in him so he can be attracted to a transsexual man? Naturally, the attraction is to the quote-unquote woman in this man. I don't know that that's the case, but okay. But could completely normal heterosexual men be able to forget the presence of male sex organs? I can tell you as a completely normal male heterosexual man, no. Or if an operation has been performed, even their former existence. Again, as a heterosexual man, most things, but I can say as a heterosexual man, no. No. A normal heterosexual guy is not going to be cool, if it's still there or if it was ever there. There's no way I would or any other normal heterosexual man I know would ever participate in that. Transsexual plays the part of an ordinary prostitute looking for a normal heterosexual man, hides his genitals with a bandage. He invites playing with his quote-unquote breasts that have usually been enlarged through hormone treatment or a plastic operation, allays suspicions that the customer may have. Much existing handicap and danger are compensated by the enormous satisfaction the transsexual derives from being so thoroughly accepted as a woman. Or it just tells you that they're already engaging in impulsive, risky behavior, the fact that they're wanting to have risky, unprotected sex with someone that they don't know, with all of the potential diseases associated with that. Obviously, some people don't care about the morality of such a situation, but you are going to increase the risk of sexually transmitted diseases, so there are direct physical health complications associated with that. How much more can this femininity be reaffirmed than by again and again attracting normal, heterosexual, and unsuspecting men, even being paid for rendering sex service as a woman? And this is one of the key things that I want to point out here, is that there's this constant pushing of this idea, well, what do you care what somebody else does, or what do you care what other people do? Well, because this is the kind of thing that they want to engage in. They want a man who, most of these men are completely unsuspecting. They only, even if they don't have a problem with somebody being quote unquote transsexual, or they don't have a problem with somebody being homosexual, people that engage in this type of behavior are preying on these guys' libido, which also is why there's many, many things that can be said with this, but you don't get to lie to somebody or misrepresent yourself. It's so funny to me because they wouldn't accept this behavior from a heterosexual man with a heterosexual woman lying or misrepresenting himself in order to get sex. Yet in this context, we don't see this as a problem. And he says in terms of male transsexuals engaged in prostitution, they are rare, possibly not more than a dozen in the whole country. Whether fewer transsexuals become prostitutes full or part-time after their operations is difficult to judge. Because of Dr. Ira S. Pauley, psychiatrist at the University of Oregon, said in a recent lecture, because of his isolation, the transsexual has not developed interpersonal skills and frequently presents the picture of a schizoid or inadequate personality, just like we've been talking about with the schizophrenic symptoms. So again, they always characterize it as they needed more acceptance. But how do you know these behaviors aren't manifesting themselves early on for other reasons? Again, we'll look at the case study of Christine Jorgensen here in an upcoming lecture. Improvement of the mental condition occurred under estrogen treatment as well as after corrective surgery, but by no means in all cases. Now, we're going to look at contemporary research here in upcoming lectures, because I know a lot of people are saying, well, what about this study that says that it helps? And what about that study? We'll go through all that stuff. We're going to go through the pro-trans position. We're going to go through, all the people, the back and forth fighting, that this study shows that they always do better, or in most cases they do better after surgery, and most people don't regret it, and blah, 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 blah. We'll see how that data is characterized, and we'll expose what sorts of tricks that they play in the research with that. But even at the outset, in the early 1960s, when he writes this book, he's saying not everybody is helped with this. So shouldn't you be making sure, because they're never going to be able to have children after this operation, shouldn't you be 100% making sure that the outcome is going to be better before saying, well, these people have no hope with psychoanalysis, they must have surgery, even though we know for some people that have the surgery and the hormones, they still don't turn out great. And again, in conjunction with this, and the overarching picture that all the pro-transgender, uber-liberal people seem to lose sight of is humanity cannot continue without reproductive capacity, period. So anything that challenges that or undermines that in any way should be put in under the utmost scrutiny, under the most stringent of microscopes. You don't just get, well, we're going to implement it and see what happens because we think that the less than 1% of the population that suffers from this might kill themselves if they don't get the surgery, even though we know for a fact that sometimes they don't do better with the surgery anyway. And you're going to leverage that on the entire population because it's only going to work if everybody's accepting of it. So we need to lobotomize any of the rest of the population that might disagree with it so there can be an optimal outcome for this less than 1% of the population, because we're 100% sure they're all going to kill themselves, and that is unacceptable relative to the potential risk to all of the rest of the heterosexual reproducing population from which all of society was built. Well, what about the homosexuals that contributed? They were born to born from heterosexual parents. Eventually, you go back enough generations, you're going to have heterosexual parents. So you don't just abandon the generative process in favor of expanding a extremely small minority group.
And here we come to what kind of psychological guidance are we giving these people? First sentence, if the transsexual does find relief in dressing, to do so should be the first logical advice given therapeutically. Full stop. So the first thing that we tell transsexual people is not, have you tried to stop or anything? Have you tried to stop or anything like that? Or what are the underlying motivations? It's, does this give you some relief of symptoms? Okay, then pursue it. But the thing is, with things like drug addiction, et cetera, if you're craving cocaine or methamphetamine, engaging in using it will make you feel better for a time because you have a, dependency on that chemical compound. So just because something makes you feel better, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the healthy thing to do, because oftentimes, just like with drug dependency, you need a larger hit the next time to get the same result. I'm not saying that this is the same thing, but I'm saying just merely making the argument that it feels better, therefore do it, is not very psychologically sound. You need to give me more than that. Its permissive character can be questioned by those who may think of the law before they think of the patient or may have insufficient experience. So first sentence is, do this, sign off on this behavior so the person feels better about themselves. Second sentence is, you're ignorant if you question this. And it's the same tactic he's used throughout this entire text. Too many individuals are that way. I've even met that what they do not like must be forbidden and punished. Again, where have you demonstrated that large-scale increase in transgender expression is going to benefit society writ large as a whole? Because that's what you should be at least able to concretely determine, that it's going to be at the very most neutral. And you've already acknowledged that it isn't, because you earlier in this book said, well, fathers that do this should not expose their children to it because you could damage them psychologically. It needs to remain hidden in some sense because you've already admitted that it damages children psychologically and changes the way that they develop. If this is taken to its conclusion, let's say everybody's a transsexual. First of all, there's not going to be any more children born, except by artificial means, which of course the government would control. So there has to be some restriction on it, but if there's some restriction on it, you can't have full expression of it, right? Because then that means that other people are living different lifestyles. Where are we going with this? What's the ultimate conclusion of this? He either hasn't thought of this, or he's only trying to leverage it against specific populations that he doesn't want to reproduce. It is my hope that this volume may induce doctors as well as laymen who come across the transsexual phenomenon to assume a tolerant and rational attitude and let the light of facts replace the ever-present twilight of prejudices. But you're prejudiced. You're prejudiced explicitly against individuals who are Catholic, right? Again, I am not Catholic. I'm not telling you to be Catholic. But they have a belief system that expressly conflicts with yours. Therefore, you believe in decreased expression of their belief system, right? So, again, it's if you want to advance a certain position, that's fine, but be honest about it and understand you don't position yourself as being this maximally tolerant whatever when you're positioning anyone that agrees with you as being ignorant or intolerant, particularly when you haven't pursued every avenue and you're willing to admit that you lack a lot of knowledge in this area. And he quotes this person as saying, we tend to look on these people as vile. Remember that their mix-up was obvious in early childhood when surely there was no vileness. I agree that a lot of people are mistreated for being different when they're young, and it can have massive psychological consequences. I'm not disputing that. He says living completely as a woman can actually be a life-saving measure for those transsexuals who find an operation unattainable. Again, we go back to the suicide defense, right? Again, we'll explore that in later detail. Merely the opportunity to talk to somebody about their problems has its therapeutic value. To find some understanding from a doctor instead of coldness, rejection, or ridicule goes a long way toward easing their burden. But the thing is, and we'll cover this in the psychotherapy section, I agree that these people probably need more social support because I believe a lot of them were isolated when they were younger, in childhood and things along those lines. I don't dispute that at all. I think that they need more understanding, but they need an explanation potentially as to why, whether it be psychological, being treated in a certain way or identifying with certain people, or biological, in utero exposure to certain chemical compounds or early childhood exposure to certain chemical compounds, or types of sexualized trauma, things of that nature. Okay. All of that should be taken into account, and an understanding should be placed on those things, not just providing enhanced explanations that further justify this person's behavior. Because again, there's so many other things that we don't do this for. If somebody is a schizophrenic, if somebody is a pedophile, if somebody is a necrophiliac, if somebody has obsessive compulsive disorder, how do we approach it? So they're going to go on to say in this next section, psychotherapy with the aim of curing transsexualism so the patient will accept himself as a man, it must be repeated here, is a useless undertaking. With present available methods, the mind of the transsexual cannot be changed in its false gender orientation. What did I show you in the Freud clip? I literally showed you someone that regretted the operation, and she was, yeah, I just was more of a tomboy. I didn't really develop into much of a girl. And so I wanted to become a boy so I could keep up with boys. And it turns out I'm autistic and I didn't really fit in. And I thought this operation was going to make me fit in, and I still don't fit in. I really regret my decision. And yet your position in the 1950s is that this is totally incurable from any form of psychotherapy. Psychotherapy has nothing to offer them. Inaccessible to psychotherapy. I've seen 10 or more patients with whom have been in analysis for as long as 3 and more years without the slightest change in their transsexual attitude. Have you pursued hormone profiles? Have you looked at environmental exposures? All those other sorts of things. Since it is evident, therefore, that the mind of transsexual cannot be adjusted to the body. So in a few sentences, and because Dr. John Aiden and Robert Laidlaw say so, we can't pursue this anymore. We have to just do surgeries. That's it. That's his argument for this. He just says it's impossible and it doesn't work because he knows 2 people that tried it for 3 years. There's an extended amount of discussion in this book on how to get operations and procuring operations. And the thing is, for somebody that's mentally or emotionally vulnerable and doesn't have an explanation as to why they're having out-of-body experiences, they could very easily come across this information and say, this must be my problem, and then reconvince themselves that that is the case. Again, I would implore you to go back to the psychological mechanisms lectures that I covered, and that was in relationship to COVID specifically. but the false memories lecture and the illusion of explanatory depth, how people think they understand how things work to a certain degree, and then when you actually question them, they don't actually understand how they work. And false memories, how you can literally, through a series of staged interviews, implant memories in people, and even when you remove the evidence for that was put in place for those memories, people will still, in many cases, persist in believing them. He uses this example. 50 years ago, as a medical student in Germany, plastic surgery began to shape noses and perform facelifting operations. His name was Joseph. He was bitterly critiqued for what he did. Surgeons such as he were refused membership in medical societies and were branded as quacks. And then sex was not even involved. So he's equating plastic surgery to look how poorly these people were treated in this example. I mean, given the rise in things like cancers and systemic inflammation, all this stuff we're seeing from all these plastic operations now, I mean, and again, with regard to plastic operations, a big part of the issue, and I don't believe I've touched on this, is one, impaired nutrition from poor farming practices. Two, we're not chewing hard food anymore, so our jaws and things like that. Our airways are undeveloped from poor breathing. All these sorts of things that are indicative of markers of health. And if we didn't have stuff like plastic surgery, we would be forced to address those actual problems as to why our faces and skulls are shaped the way that they are, and we could actually improve our health instead of just cosmetically adjusting things around. So he looks at operative data from transsexuals. Most were operated in Denmark, Holland, or Sweden, a few in Mexico, and he references Dr. Elmer Belt. Personal data. What kind of occupations do these people have? And it was out of a total of 51 people. Office work, salesperson, musician, store proprietor, hairdresser, housewife, stockbroker, show business, domestic, office manager, prostitute, teaching, practical nurse or companion, photography, retired, unknown. I don't see a single rancher. I don't see a single construction worker, any of these outdoor typical masculine professions represented at all here. But what I do see, office worker, housewife, stockbroker, all these stuff, a lot of them are handling ink-based compounds, or prostitute. Teaching, a lot of them are handling ink-based compounds that can potentially act as endocrine disruptors. I'm not saying that that's the reason for all this. I'm just pointing that out here. And hypogonadism is represented about 40% of these people. So if they were given testosterone injections, or rather, and better, identification of why the hypogonadism is caused, endocrine disrupting compounds, chronic stress, in utero exposures, impaired nutrition, those things could potentially be remedied. Early childhood development of transsexualism. Puberty for 2, unknown for 6. Results of the conversion operation. Good, 17 of the 51. Satisfactory, that means just okay, 53%. Doubtful 5, unsatisfactory, unknown 1 and 1. So that's not quite the harmonious picture that he'd been presenting the entire time. The joy, the relief they experienced from getting estrogen, the wonders of getting the surgery. 17 of the 51 said they feel good about the results. That's it. Everything else is just okay or less. Does that seem like life-changing numbers to you? When only a third say they feel good about it. And this isn't like 20 years out, by the way, that we're talking about. Again, adult conversation here. When it comes to orgasm, definite orgasmic ability with more or less distinct ejaculation from the urethra was described by more than half of these 51 patients. What does more than half mean? Does that mean 26? Does that mean 25 of 51 people couldn't orgasm anymore as a result of the operation? It didn't, although the orgasm did not take place on every occasion, which is the case in normal relationships too. The explanation for the orgasm without a clitoris and natural vagina is probably twofold. I'm not going to go into that discussion, but the point is, clearly there's a drop-off in sexual pleasure for these individuals. They say it's a great delight for him to view genitals in the mirror. Then how come only 17 of the 51 felt good about their post-operative outcome? Of the 39 unmarried, 23 reported sex relations. Of these, 9 are part or full-time prostitutes. 51 people, 39 of the 51 are unmarried. Okay, they don't talk about the status of what happens to those 12 marriages. They don't talk about if these people hope to be married, how much did it decrease the odds of that. And nearly 20% of these people are prostitutes. Scientific reports as to results of the operation are so far meager indeed, but will most likely increase in the literature. Full stop. So wait a minute. Of your 50, this is a sample size of 51. Of your 51 people that you've taken through this, 9 of them are prostitutes, 39 of them are unmarried. Some arbitrary number less than half can't achieve orgasm anymore. You're also exposing them to infection risk. You're also exposing them to future urinary tract problems. And you don't even have a significant amount of scientific reports by which to base this on. Yet you've repeatedly ridiculed anybody that criticizes your position. What are we doing here, Harry Benjamin? It seems like you have an ulterior motive. Leo Wollman, noted gynecologist and student of hypnotism. If you want a maximally creepy epitaph on your gravestone, put gynecologist and hypnotist on there. Just go ahead and do that. But anyway, this Leo Wollman, before irrevocable surgery makes the transition from male to female physically permanent, it is essential that a psychiatric evaluation and a psychological examination be done. This is indicated for the protection of the physician as well as the patient. Also, a period of observation under estrogen therapy to reduce libido and tension is recommended. So, what can another potential psychological benefit, quote unquote, be to this? Well, guess what? These people have abnormal sexual desires. As we'll see, that's a common thing that happens with genital mutilation. The source of the problem might not be the fact that they want to be a woman or want to be a man. It might be that there's some sort of trauma, abnormal sexual behavior that they want to get rid of. And the immediate sense of relief they get from being on hormone therapy is not a result of now they're closer to being a woman or they're closer to being whatever. It's that the hormone treatment that they're receiving has crushed their libido, and so those sexual fantasies that they don't like have been reduced. They also give advice on how to avoid arrest. So these people are really facilitating. They've identified this disorder. People like Freud with his Oedipal complex, all these psychoanalysts have identified the historical underpinnings of this condition through anthropological and mythological means. And then they've engineered a system by which to expand and perpetuate this practice in Western societies that they know would be resistant to it. Okay? Why wouldn't you I'm going to open up a practice in some region of Africa, let's say, or I'm going to open up a practice in some Native American area, and then they don't have laws against it, so anybody from all over the world can come and get this operation here. Why are you trying to specifically target all these European countries, create networks for this stuff, and build them out, and disseminate them across all these publications? And again, if you would doubt my connecting this to the esoteric lectures that I touched on, the esoteric lecture where I touched on the origins of these ideas, Harry Benjamin makes this explicit. Mythology and demonology. He talks about Greek mythology having transsexual influence, dramatized designations of the goddesses who responded in the yearnings of feminine souls locked in male bodies. A specific myth where a man killed a female snake, and as a result, he was changed into a woman. He testified that a woman's pleasure during the act of procreation was 10 times as much as a man, and then he was changed back into a man as punishment. He referenced the Scythians that I talked about in the first lecture. He doesn't reference them riding on horses, but he says they were called no men who resembled eunuchs, and that they follow women's occupations. He talks about the ancient kingdom of Phrygia, where the priests of God were obliged to castrate themselves in deference to God. Again, this is where, atheists. The Tiresias myth noted previous parallels as related folktales in East Indian lore. A king transformed into a woman by bathing in a magic river, bore 100 sons. Not only did gods empower one to change one's sex, but a change of sex was performed on both human and beast by witchcraft and by the intervention of demons. Witches were claimed to be possessors of drugs and had the capacity to reverse the sex of the taker. Thus it was declared that the devil could make males of females but could not transform men into women, because it is a method of nature to add on rather than take away. In Malleus Maleficarum, Hammer Against Witches, the book which served as a source of treatment of the insane for nearly 300 years, an eyewitness accounting report of a girl changing into a boy by the devil at Rome. In classical history, Philo, the Jewish philosopher of Alexandria, wrote, expending every possible care on their outward adornment, they were not ashamed to employ every device to change artificially their nature as men into women, some of them craving a complete transformation, amputated their generative members. Nero killed his pregnant wife and allegedly found a male slave that looked similar to her, castrated the male slave and married it, supposedly. Sa Majesté, which literally means Her Majesty, the feminine gender was used in deference to King Henry III of France, who wished to be considered a woman. So they have all this historical stuff. Many of these citations are from France. They look at cross-cultural data. Many Native American tribes. They reference the Yuma, the Kokopo, the Mojave, and they perform practices such as scratching themselves till they bleed, and then stopping when they quote-unquote become pregnant, and then going defecating essentially and calling it an aborted fetus. That's the kind of pregnancies that we're witnessing. The Iowamusp formed a regular social grade, dressed as women, perform women's tasks. Navajo, persons called Nadali, a term used for either transvestites or hermaphrodites, but usually the former, were addressed by their kinship to the woman. The Iowamusp of the California Indians formed a regular social grade, dressed as women, perform women's tasks. When an Indian showed a desire to shirk his manly duties, he would be made to position in a circle of fire, and a woman's stick would be offered to him. The Pueblo followed alleged practice as described. One of the most powerful men was chosen. He was masturbated many times a day and made to ride horseback almost continuously, and eventually he started losing his manhood. And then they basically said developed mammary glands the size of a childbearing woman, and that he had supposedly nursed several infants. Again, why are we trying to emulate these practices? He talks about the Mediterranean. He says the Yakut of Aboriginal Siberia were two categories of shaman, the white representing creative and the black representing destructive forces. The latter tended to behave like women. Hair was parted in the middle. They wore iron circles over the coat representing breasts. As the people of Siberia, the change of sex was found chiefly among Paleo-Siberians. Among the Chukchis near the Arctic coast, there is reported a special branch of shamanism in which men and women were alleged to undergo a change in sex, in part or completely. In Madagascar, exhibited feminine traits from birth. They were dressed like women, arranged the hair like women, pursued feminine occupations. Their girlish in appearance and mannerisms were selected out of their peers and then raised as girls. In Brazilian tribes, masculine women were given male occupations, and they were given a woman who served married to them. The Lango men from Uganda dress as women, stimulate menstruation, become one of the wives of the other males. Southwestern German Africa and among the Diakite, Saraclisi, and the French Sudan, men assume the dress, attitude, and manners of women. Among Zulus, change of sex by disguise with the method of changing or reverting bad luck. In India, it is usual to bore the nose of a son as soon as to be born and turn him into a girl. On the Aleutian boys, if they were very handsome, they would be brought up entirely in the manner of girls, instructed in the arts of women used to please men. Their beards would be carefully plucked out as soon as they appear. So he's invoking these tribes and things like gods and demons, altering people's structure, as well. Look how natural this is Does it sound like any of these practices are natural or healthy when you're scratching yourself till you bleed and forcing people against their will to ride? What about the forcible demasculinization? Does that not pose any problems in Harry Benjamin's mind in this process?
Now, at the end, I'm not going to show you all these because some of these are basically naked from the top, from the waist up. But in the end, he shows photographs of these people, and he says, "A rather effeminate boy, 1963." Now, although this person is not the maximum masculine looking person, he's still not as effeminate as, like, let's say Justin Bieber or someone of that ilk. So the idea that this person has no potential to be well adjusted simply because they don't look like Arnold Schwarzenegger or Sam Elliott or something is pretty silly. And so let's be forewarned, if you do download this document, there are some nude images in it. Just in case you're confused about the role Harry Benjamin might view himself, here he has a statue here of a hermaphrodite, and here he is posing somebody that is quote-unquote transition. Now, I've covered the image up, but they've started providing estrogen to this person, so the beginnings of breast development have taken place, but they still have their male anatomy, and here he is posing them in the same position as this statue. And this famous picture, again, I blurred out the image at the bottom, but is pulling up the skirt, and there's clearly visible male anatomy here, and uses this quote: "The astounding monster born of the lust of a nymph and a half-god shows his ambiguous form amidst the splendor of the precious stones." So he's invoking the same hermaphroditic imagery that we saw in the very first lecture related to the esoteric ideas, the hermaphroditic deity quoted in Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, some of the post-Christian Kabbalistic ideas and things of that nature. So very clearly using this iconography for a reason. Do we think there's any scientific reason for him to have included this in the last page of his book? And any sort of reason for him to symbolically pose some of his patients in the same poses as the statue here?